On the surface, it might look like Mark Consuelos has $1 million smile, but the Live with Kelly and Mark talk show host and actor has revealed that his front set of teeth might actually come up a few cents short. The 54-year-old shared on Wednesday's episode of the daytime series that he's been living with a missing tooth for almost 5 decades, after losing it upon smashing his face into an obstacle course in the 4th grade, an incident he called very traumatic on the air. There was a certain time that I had to have an implant because it was just done. I had enough trauma, Consuelos told the audience, adding that he had to put a cap on it for many years. He then recounted an instance where he boarded a plane from New York City to Vancouver to film an episode of the hit CW drama series Riverdale, which led to a moment of panic ahead of cameras going up on the actor. I had the flipper, he said, referencing a sheath used in the mouth, but he noted that it impacted his speech as he tried to act on the show. As we're taking off, it pops out. I've got to be on this flight for the next 5.5 hours and make it through without swallowing it and keeping it in there. Luckily, I had my flipper with me, but I didn't tell anybody else. Consuelos said he was able to get through just one day of work without anyone noticing that his missing tooth was nearly exposed on set. Consuelos' wife and live co-host, Kelly Ripa, 55, then added that while her husband has a dazzling smile, if you take away that front tooth, I was like, oh, so it really was in sickness and in health, but they didn't say anything about dental health. Ripa then noted that the case of the missing tooth sometimes comes up in their personal life, including when her husband came home a few days after the aforementioned Riverdale shoot, only to have his tooth fall out before they went to dinner with friends. I went toothless to this restaurant. I didn't care. I looked funny, Consuelos said. Ripa added, he loves popping the tooth out to shock people. He becomes a different person entirely. It's wild. The couple then promised that they'd find and share with the audience a photo of Consuelos' missing tooth. Entertainment Weekly will update this post with new information and potentially visuals when it becomes available. He remembers the fall as if it were a sudden, brilliant punctuation in the slow sentence of his childhood. The squeal of sneakers against wet gym floor, the shout of a teacher turned anxious, the taste of blood like pennies and iron, and then, most insistently, the absence. A little white crescent where a boy's grin had been whole. Mark was 9 when the obstacle course took his tooth. That was how the story began, at least. A small boy launched into air by a mistimed leap, a forehead meeting pipe, teeth meeting wood, and one decisive, humiliating, permanent vacancy. He sat on the curb outside the school office with his shirt collar damp at the throat, fingers sticky with blood, and he learned very early what other people noticed first. They did not notice the scraped knees, the olive-brown bruise curling toward his temple, or the way his hands trembled when he tried to button his jacket. They noticed his mouth. Kids' stares had the particular bluntness of small animals, surprise, delight, a cruel sort of curiosity. Adults asked if he was all right, and then because adults were adults and had their scripts, they laughed like it was a minor inconvenience and told him he'd grow into his face again. The dentist in a lamplit office told him, with professional kind of economy, that his smile could be patched. A cap, an implant later in life, a flipper to wear between photo shoots. He swallowed the first flipper like it was medicine for a shy heart. Awkward, necessary, temporary. Mark, already bright, already winning at life in a way that made other children and eventually casting directors glance twice. Learned to walk through rooms as if he carried a secret. Not a shame exactly. A secret. He learned to modulate his grin, because a grin was currency in the parts of his life that mattered, auditions and camera tests, morning talk show rehearsals where the camera could linger for 3 counting breaths, and romantic dinners where the waitress might become the first teacher of his future. He polished his laugh until it shone. He practiced jokes until the gaps between punchline and audience felt invisible. The missing tooth remained stubbornly private, an odd little absence behind a professionally applied veneers that made his smile glitter so reliably on magazine covers. The tooth had a way of making him feel like 2 people occupying one body. One was the man the cameras loved to see, confident, funny, built to bounce. The other was the boy who had learned to tuck something fragile and embarrassing into a back pocket and walk on. That tension made him lean toward performance, toward things that allowed him to control how the world looked at him. He became an actor of gestures, an urgency in his eyes, a tilt to his head, an almost theatrical widening of his smile that promised more than it delivered. He discovered over the years that he could get away with almost anything if he choreographed the reveal, a sudden hand over mouth to distract, a quick tilt to the camera that left audiences thinking of movie star charisma rather than dental misadventure. He learned the art of misdirection, which served him in romantic scenes, in fights eventually resolved by tenderness, and on talk show couches where a personal anecdote could be the whole difference between a segment that landed and a segment that missed. So when he met Kelly, it was not merely that she loved him, though she did, with a ferocity she kept private and then made public like a flag, but that he had already, in secret, been practicing being known. Kelly Ripa had eyes that found him like lighthouses find boats, not just the shine, but the way he moved against it. She saw through his rehearsed grin to the man who would pop a tooth out at a dinner party just to watch the slack-jawed reaction of an exasperated friend. He would tell you later, over coffee that simmered into afternoons, that the teeth were a currency for mischief. She would laugh in a way that recognized the boy again, and sometimes with the boy still inside him, she would pretend not to know the trick and then be scandalously delighted when he did it. They built a life that seemed to the outside world as close to perfect as a picture from a glossy magazine, a marriage threaded by quirks and rituals that became their secret language. To him, Kelly was safety personified, a partner who could take a room's hum into a lullaby and then, with one look, turn it into a riot. To her, he was the man who would deliberate between charcuterie boards and then, when the moment required it, be outrageously, embarrassingly silly. There was a trust in that balance that had little to do with veneers, dental implants, or missing molars. It had to do with the capacity to show up, tooth in or tooth out, and still be loved. One of his favorite tricks, something he performed for exactly the kind of people who like to be shocked, was the flipper reveal. He could slide it out like a magician producing a coin, hand pressed to the mouth as if the movement were an involuntary tick, and the world would tilt. Close friends would snort laugh. Strangers would glance away embarrassed, unsure whether to gasp or to offer comfort. Kelly would roll her eyes and call it juvenile, but she loved the drama like a smoker loves a particular brand of cigarette, tolerated with indulgent amusement because it was undeniably part of him. He becomes a different person entirely, she would tell interviewers, smiling wide and then covering her mouth as if to withhold the punchline. The Riverdale Flyer, the episode that would later become a favorite anecdote at parties and on morning television, started as a practical nightmare and unfolded into a small, private comedy of panic. He had been on the plane to Vancouver, the flipper snug in his pocket like a spare identity. He'd been trying to act, to play the complex father figure he now inhabited on that glossy teen drama, and his teeth had been part of the costume puzzle, makeup to match lines on his face, wardrobe to hide shoulder roll, and dental prosthetics to make his smile look seamless in close-ups. The flipper popped like a soap bubble, a small wet sound against the hum of the engines, a soft clack that set off alarms inside his head. For 5.5 hours, he was an acrobat balancing a small, ridiculous object between life and accident. He imagined swallowing it and choking on a tiny white rectangle of plastic and teeth. He imagined someone on the flight recoiling in horror and reaching for him as if he had suddenly taken ill. He held the prosthesis in his mouth like a secret, shifting it like a child shifting a guilty toy under a pillow. He had to work the next day, and so he did. He became an actor who had just spent 5 hours performing a highly specific, low-grade panic, and he delivered exactly 1 day of work without anyone noticing. The story makes for a good laugh in interviews as he tells it now with self-mockery. I had to make it 1 day. I made it. Nobody knew. The audience loves the small triumph of human absurdity in the face of celebrity. There are people, of course, who believe in an ideal of image as armor. They would have had an implant as a child, corrected the accident like a weather anomaly fixed by engineers. But Mark kept the absence as if it were a wound that told him something important. That vulnerability is not only something to be patched but a language unto itself. There is a power in showing the fragile parts, in letting the architecture of your life display the scaffolding. He performed for people who loved his shape but were always relieved to discover the seams. The story of teeth is also a story about control. He liked being able to pop the tooth out to shock people because it restored to him the control lost in 4th grade. The suddenness of the fall, the humiliation in front of classmates, the way the world rearranged his attention.